Now, it is my privilege and honor to call on stage Ambassador Salah S. Hammad, who is going to be our keynote address speaker all the way from Ethiopia. Let's give him a round of applause, please. As he comes up, let me introduce him. Ambassador Hammad is the head of the African Governance, Peace and Security Architecture Secretariat, and is the senior human rights expert within the Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security of the African Union Commission. And originally, he is from Sudan. Ambassador Hammad studied political science and human rights law in the United States of America. He was voted in as an ambassador for human rights by the Arab Council for Human Rights in 2013 and appointed as ambassador within Sudan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2016. For the past 25 years, Ambassador Hammad has dedicated his life to the world development, good governance, democracy, and human rights. As an international expert, he has worked on issues of governance, peace and security, human rights. I spoke to him some time ago. He was telling me about the work that they had done in Nigeria. And so he's been all over dealing with issues of humanitarian affairs, refugees, resettlement. And it is my honor to present to you Ambassador Hammad. Again, a round of applause to give us a keynote address. Ambassador, thank you so much for coming. Pleasure to have you here. All right.
Well, first of all, my brother Patrick, I don't know if your wife has told you that you have a very wonderful voice as a singer. And after retirement, if you need a manager to manage your business as a singer, please let me know. This is one. Secondly, I'm glad you got my last name right because I used to go by the last name Muhammad. And then Muhammad Salah got me mixed with the footballer Mohamed Salah. So every time I go in Africa visiting a country, the hotel staff will be expecting the real Mohamed Salah. And then when they see this big man coming in instead of the sharp and good-looking, handsome Mohamed Salah, they will wonder. So that is why now I go with Hammad as the last name instead of Mohammed. But it's still in many cases, people will not really pronounce Hammad as Hammad, and they will pronounce it Muhammad. But anyhow, thank you so very much really for the invitation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, all protocol duly observed. I bring you greetings from the African Union Commission in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in particular from members of the African Governance Architecture and the African Peace and Security Architecture Platform. And I'm pleased to be part of this 10th anniversary celebration of this great institution, Good Governance Africa. I'm delighted and honored to be invited to deliver this keynote address before you this morning. But before I proceed, I would like to thank Mr. Robert Rose, the GGA founder and global chairman, Mr. Patrick Kulati, the CEO of GGA Africa and his team, and all those who have been part of this program and this celebration this morning. Indeed, it is timely that we are celebrating this 10th anniversary as we are proceeding with the implementation of the second 10 action plan of Agenda 2063 to build the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. I think it's also quite important to recognize the presence of His of Honorable Justice Richard Goldstone, the Vice Chairman of Integrity Initiatives International, as well as all the experts and all the distinguished participants that we have around the table today. I also would like to recognize the presence of my dear assistant friend and colleague from APRM, the African Peer Review Mechanisms, Sarah Hammad, and all the other distinguished participants. At the outset, let's try to really speak about why we need to address issues related to good governance in Africa. Africa, that we all know today, is about 60 years old, but in reality, Africa is the birthplace for mankind and human beings. But we are speaking about Africa that is 60 years old simply because that is after independence. South Africa emerged as a young continent that at some point was classified as hopeless. But indeed, a few years later, those who classified Africa as a hopeless continent, as a dark continent, came to look at it as the future of the world, as a rising continent. And that is why our heads of state and government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, decided to adopt Agenda 2063 as the blueprint for building the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. But the question is, are we really on the right path to implement Agenda 2063? Are we on the right path to build the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve? Throughout the colonial period and even post-colonial period, Africa indeed was governing itself in a way or another. We have learned when we were growing up about traditional forms of governments, traditional forms of justice, traditional forms of financial systems that were managing our societies, our communities across the continent. The colonial power took over. Africa went through a period of slavery, colonialism, and then at some point emerged and dived in civil wars that resulted in poverty, corruption, and exclusions of marginalized groups. Then, after independence and after the creation of the Organization of the African Unity, known as OAU, in 1963, our leaders were quite busy with the liberation of the continent from the colonial power. But in 2000, as we all know, on the 9th of September, 1999, that is 9/9/1999, our heads of state and government came to agree in Sirte, Libya, on the need to transform the Organization of African Unity to what is known now as the African Union, AU. And the reason for the transformation was that Africa has passed the stage of liberation, and now the era of building a new Africa, a stronger Africa, has begun. And that is why the entire mandate of the African Union is built on integration, development, and of course, the promotion of good governance, democracy, rule of law. And because of that, our heads of state and government, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, adopted a number of instruments. The African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the African Charter on the welfare of the child, and many, many other treaties, including treaties that are focusing on good governance, such as the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, and also treaties that are fighting corruptions, as the African Convention on Combating and Fighting Corruption. But with all of these treaties, and in instruments, we are still lacking behind when it comes to the indexes that are rating other continents compared to Africa. And that is why, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the African Union has decided to work very closely with the regional economic communities, known as RECs, and the wider African civil society, academia, media, as well as our African member states, to try to promote and to deepen the roots of good governance at the national level. This came through the introduction of the instruments that I have mentioned earlier, but also through the introduction of a number of mechanisms at the continental level to observe and ensure the implementation of these treaties at the national level. And the reason for all this process is to promote good governance in Africa. So the question is, why do we really need to promote good governance? The answer is very simple. We are not really duplicating or trying to duplicate success stories or successful stories from other regions of the world. But we are trying to create our own African-owned successful story. So when we are talking about democracies, when we are talking about good governance, we are not really talking about issues that we are exporting, we are importing from elsewhere, but in fact, things that we are exporting from within ourselves to become our contribution to the global jurisprudence. We Africans, we do believe in democracy and good governance, and that is why even before being colonized by colonial power, we used to adhere ourselves to social systems that were created at every layer of our societies and communities. We used to respect our chiefs, we used to respect our leaders, and we used to follow the democratic governance processes that were in place at that time. So therefore, believing in democracy and good governance is no stranger element to our African shared values. But unfortunately, after independence, we have been hit hard by strange elements that really corrupted our good governance beliefs. And that led, of course, to not corruption in the financial sector, but also corruption in the governance sector, where each and every individual who claimed the ladder of governance implement his or her own views of governance, democracy, and rule of law that divided our societies and communities, but also divided our nations, despite the attempts by our founding mothers and fathers to unite and integrate the continent. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I wish to also draw your kind attention to the fact that Africa has been struggling with governance deficits that has an impact not only on the political stability, but also led to the emergence of a number of conflicts in many parts of our continent. These conflicts are now affecting our economies, societies, culture, and also our socio-economic situations. And that is why our African head of state and government, when they transformed the Organization of the African Unity to the AU in 2000 and officially in 2002 in Durban, South Africa, they came with an idea to also at the same time establish what is known as the African Peace and Security Architecture, APSA. And the purpose of the APSA was to manage conflicts that were erupting at that time in many parts of the continent. The APSA led to the establishment of what is known today as the Peace and Security Council of the African Union, a mechanism with binding decisions on peace and security issues on the continent. But a few years later, in particular in 2011, is not to wait for conflicts to erupt, but to prevent, a preventive tool to prevent conflicts from happening and to promote good governance, democracy, rule of law as a tool of prevention of conflicts in Africa. The AGA operates in a way that it brings member states along with the regional economic communities, African Union and African Union organs, and the civil society, academia, think tanks, and media to collectively speak with one voice on governance issues in Africa. One of the major activities currently in place that is implemented by the AGA-APSA Secretariat, what is known as the African Citizen Engagement Strategy. The strategy is meant for it to bring the African Union closer to the African people, and then for the African citizens to empower themselves with the knowledge and information they need about the instruments that are promoting good governance, democracy, and rule of law on the continent, so then they can equip themselves with the knowledge and information that is needed for them to be active citizens at all levels, national, continental, as well as regional level. In addition to that, the African Union, through the AGA, is currently very busy trying to engage the African youth in the governance affairs, also at all levels. And that is because Africa is a young continent, as we all know. And that is because almost 65% of the population of Africa are below the age of 35. So as the majority of the African citizens, we felt it is important for the African Union to invent a number of training programs, orientations, manuals, and to mobilize the necessary funds at all levels to engage youth and to train them and to prepare them for building this continent. But also during the training program, we keep reminding our youth that they are not the leaders of tomorrow. They are in fact the leaders of today and the leaders of tomorrow. And we do so then we can try to change the mindset of the African youth to be part of this movement of implementing Agenda 2063, the movement of change that will lead to building the Africa we want and the Africa we deserve. With all of these, challenges still exist. And some of these challenges that have been recently noticed in the Sahel region by the resurgence of a number of unconstitutional changes of government. Although the African Union Commission condemn any form of unconstitutional change of governments, but regrettably we have seen in particular the African youth celebrating some of these unconstitutional changes of government. And this is a question for our members of the academia that are present with us here and the experts in the field to advise on why some of these unconstitutional changes of government were celebrated. The obvious answer, of course, is that the youth are eager to see change. And they believe when they see a leader coming to take over the power with promises of change, then that leader is supported. But unfortunately, the leader will then not keep the promises made. And the changes were promised will not become a reality. And then the country will dive into a long term of transition that will not really take the country anywhere. And this is really what has been experienced in a number of African member states that witnessed coup d'etats before. And in this case, let me mention the country that I was born in, and that is Sudan. Sudan have witnessed more than 26 attempts of coup d'etats since its independence in 1956. 26. Almost 9 of them were successful. And where is Sudan today? 65 years after independence. A war. So that means coup d'etats, unconstitutional changes of government can never be the answer. So then what could be done to try to promote good governance, democracy, and rule of law, and how to fight corruption in Africa? The African Union Commission is currently very busy popularizing the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, known as AGDEC. And this is a great opportunity for me to call on all of you around the table today to do what you can do to promote this treaty at your level and within your networks. The treaty supports other treaties and African shared values that are promoting good governance, democracy, and rule of law in Africa. It is in fact the African jurisprudence or the African contribution to the global jurisprudence when it comes to the promotion of good governance, democracy, and rule of law. Currently, from 55 member states, we have 39 ratifications. But from the 39 ratifications, only 2 member states have submitted the reports to prove implementation at the national level. And sadly, the first country to ratify this important treaty was the first country to experience a coup d'etat 3 months after ratification. That is Mauritania. Mauritania was the first country to ratify 3 months after ratification, and we were celebrating, in fact, in the African Union. Mauritania, unfortunately, fell into unconstitutional changes of government. So therefore, it is quite important for us as Africans to take the lead. Yes, there are so many challenges, but many other continents went through these similar challenges and they were able to overcome the challenges. So why it is so difficult for us that we can't really manage our diversities, manage our resources, manage our affairs, and promote good governance, democracy, and rule of law? And again, as Africans, we can't really say that our history was not or never reflected the forms of democracies that existed before the colonial time. So again, when we speak about democracy, rule of law, and human rights, constitutionalism, we are not really talking about things that we don't know. In fact, we are talking about elements and pillars that we as Africans contributed to building them and to establishing them. One of the greatest challenges, I believe, that we are currently facing is the reality that our history was not written by us as Africans. And Professor could correct me if I'm wrong. So maybe the time has come for us as Africans to rewrite our history and to be proud of ourselves, of our African heritage. And when we are speaking about Africa, we are speaking about different languages, different cultures, different religion, different colors. And that's what makes Africa very unique, a very unique continent, this diversity we have. So in order for us to build this continent and to advance democracies and rule of law in Africa, we need to, first of all, believe in our African heritage and African history. But also, I do believe that we need to advance our efforts to build transformative leadership within our youth. So then when they claim the ladder and they climb the ladder later in the future, they are well prepared to lead the continent. We need to empower our women. Without empowering our women, Africa will not advance and Africa will not progress. And I hope, Mr. Rose, when we come for the celebration of the 20th anniversary, we'll see more women around the table celebrating that anniversary. The promotion of constitutionalism is quite important. We have very good constitutions in Africa, but many Africans don't even know what we have in our own constitutions at the national level. So there is really need to promote constitutionalism based on the constitutions that we have. We need to also think of ways and means to promote the nexus between peace and security, good governance, and development. Because it is difficult really to preach within a community or a society where they don't have access to water. You cannot really speak about democracy and human rights to people that they're hungry. So development is quite important in this process. Last but not least, we speak about the regional economic community, civil society, and academia. But I think we really need to find a way to enhance that relationship between the regional economic communities, the African Union, and the wider civil society and academia. And this is an invitation to GGA to support the work of the African Union in good governance, democracy, and rule of law. I'm sure there's a lot that we can work together on to really promote at the national level. Excuse me. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, I wish to reiterate the commitment of the leaders of the African Union to advance the implementation of Agenda 2063. But certainly that could not be done without the involvement of all African citizens. And that is why when the invitation was received, the invitation of AGA to attend this celebration, it was well received, in fact, and it was seen as an opportunity to come and appeal to all of you around the table today to support the work of the African Union. Many people think that the African Union is not doing its job, and I will not blame you, because almost 95% of the funding of the African Union, our continental organization, comes from partners. So the question is, what could be done? Mr. Robert mentioned that there's millions of entrepreneurs and businessmen and women in Africa. How can they be attracted to support the work of the African Union as Africans? So today, I hope at the end of this program, as much as you are building for your next 10 years, I hope you will also advise the African Union on how to progress, on how to become a stronger organization. Because once you are an African, you are the African Union. And this Africa belongs to all of us Africans. And Africa can fit all of us. It's a beautiful continent, as we all know. But the question is, how can we collectively believe that we can build this continent together? How can we collectively believe that there is no one can come from Mars or Venus to build this continent for us, but it is upon us and for us to build this continent so we can make it a better place? I thank you very much.